It's a distinct pleasure for me to introduce our next keynote speaker. Luka Lukic is an associate professor at the Department of Social Science and Cultural Studies at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. Luka's research employs narrative inquiry to explore the effects of radical change, such as migration, war, and urban destruction, on socio-cognitive development of young people. Across his work, language is seen as an important tool for psychological development, enabling young people to make sense of challenging life situations while also facilitating cognitive growth. Today, Luca will speak to us with the title Cognitive Development in Times of Radical Change, Education and Learning. Luca, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. My name is Luka Lucic. I am a professor of psychology at Pratt Institute in New York City and Brooklyn. Before I begin my talk today, which is entitled Cognitive Development in Times of Radical Change, Education and Learning, I would like to thank the organizers, American University of Paris, and especially Martin Dege for inviting me to be the part of the conference and to be with you here today. I'm not going to talk directly about the COVID-19 um, today for two reasons. First, I'm sure you've heard a lot about it already. And second, I think it's really hard to make a critical assessment of a situation that's so overwhelmingly present. We are still very much amidst the sociocultural crisis caused by the outbreak of the disease. And I'm sure that, just like me, most of you find it really difficult to make sense of the radical change that we have been thrust into. Instead, I will talk about a different crisis, one that took place roughly 30 years ago, in order to see if it can offer us a lens and grant us some perspective that we can start to use to make sense of what's happening to us today and around us. Namely, over the past 8 years, I've been working on and researching the military siege of Sarajevo, specifically trying to trace and articulate developmental effects that the 4 year long military siege which Sarajevo was subjected to had on young people who lived there. Drawing upon the empirical study that I conducted with young people, as well as archival research with educational institutions that functioned during the siege, in this presentation I will attempt to explain how my research led me to understand the conditions of radical change as those circumstances in which space and time, these two very basic categories of human existence, abruptly and suddenly compress, expand, or otherwise change. In other words, I will try to show you how change in experience of space and time, brought about by the military siege, fundamentally transformed meaning within the city of Sarajevo and altered the activities of Sarajevans. And this is perhaps where the connection with the current crisis and the COVID-19 comes into play. The outbreak of COVID-19 is also forcing us to abruptly come to terms with different experiences of space and time, heightened either by the anxiety of the disease or by the effects of the prolonged lockdowns and quarantines. So, instead of examining the current major global crisis directly, I think it's too large and too overwhelming to examine yet. Um, I am going to look at it through the prism of a more minor and regionally bound crisis, but one that I still believe had global ramifications. So, before I begin, I would like to talk a little bit about the context of the talk. First, I will talk about the context about Sarajevo, about the war and the siege. I will then talk about the conditions of war and how they lead to radical change. This is not the part of the talk that you should find very surprising. War leads to radical change. However, I will also talk about how radical change transforms our experience of space and time, and how new experience of space and time altered meaning and transformed human activities within the city of Sarajevo. Uh, at the end, I will talk about the effects of radical change on thought processes and sense making, and I will talk to you about a study that I conducted over the past 6 or 7 years there. It is my hope that this presentation will leave you with a slightly more heterogeneous understanding of the dynamics of change during the crisis, and a more comprehensive understanding of how they may bear relevance on our psychological processes. So let's begin. So as soon as the siege started, it was becoming obvious that city and the built environment were going to play an important role in the upcoming nationalist conflict. A graffiti exchange on Sarajevo's main post office building, which you can see here in the slide, featured a few days after it was set on fire on May 2nd of 1992, provides a good example of this. The first graffiti, written presumably by Serbian nationalists, read, "This is Serbia." During the night, word Serbia was crossed out. Somebody added the word Bosnia. So the graffiti was amended to read, "This is Bosnia." The very next day, a clever materialist pun was added. Both Serbia and Bosnia were crossed out, and the graffiti now read, "This is post office, idiots." The incident revealed a lot about things to come over the next 4 years of the siege. In sharp contrast with Second World War, the previous war for liberation also fought on Bosnian territory. Bosnian War of the 1990s was shaping to be an urban conflict, with cities acting as contested spaces, the center stages on which the conflict would play out. This was not surprising given that much progress and urbanization has been achieved over the past 45 years. Namely, in the period between 1945, when the Second World War ended, and 1991, when the ethno-nationalist conflicts across Yugoslavia started, Bosnia has undergone a massive industrialization and modernization. Emerging out of the Second World War as one of the least urbanized regions in Europe, Bosnia was developing rapidly, with Sarajevo, a complex multi-ethnic social organism, at its center. For example, during the period of most rapid modernization and urbanization between 1948 and 1991, Sarajevo grew from a provincial town of roughly 100,000 inhabitants into a modern city inhabited by 500,000 people. In 1949, University of Sarajevo was established, and the rate of literacy was approaching 97% in 1991. Moreover, during the period of rapid growth, Sarajevo became an important industrial hub in what is now known as former Yugoslavia. During this time, as you will soon see represented on the map, and what will become of crucial importance for the siege, the city experienced a linear expansion on an east-west axis along Miljacka River. Situated in the middle of the valley, Sarajevo is surrounded by hills and 4 mountains, which are residentially developed mainly in their lower elevations. Like many other cities in the region, it has a very complex urban identity. Sarajevo was once an Ottoman city, an Austro-Hungarian city, a socialist city, and an Olympic city. At the end, it transformed into a war city as well. Throughout history, it has been partially destroyed and rebuilt. In 1984, Sarajevo became the focus of world attention by hosting the 14th Winter Olympic Games. When the Olympic Committee awarded the 1984 Winter Olympics to Sarajevo, citing the wish to host the Games in a multicultural city in order to project the image of world peace and brotherhood among people, even the most pessimistic observers could not have foreseen that less than a decade later, a war would break out there. In the years closely preceding the war, the population of the city was ethnically and religiously diverse. Close to half of the population declared themselves as Bosniak or Muslim, 30% as Serb, 7% as Croatian, while 11% embraced the pan-ethnic category of declaring themselves as Yugoslav. Data showed that preceding the war, the ethnic and religious intermarriage rate, a very good measure of intergroup integration, was high. Every 5th marriage involved partners from different ethnic and religious backgrounds. Sarajevo is a narrow city surrounded by the hills and mountains of the Dinaric Alps. Straddling the narrow Miljacka River, Sarajevo is 15 kilometers long along the east-west axis and only 4 to 6 kilometers wide, depending on where you take the measure. Crowded into a narrow valley between steep foothills and four Olympic mountains, in military strategic terms, the city is in an exceptionally poor defensive position. As such, it could not have been more perfectly situated for siege planners. The siege of Sarajevo began in spring of 1992, on the eve of European community's recognition of Bosnia as an independent state. It was finally lifted more than 4 years later, in the spring of 1996, lasting for more than 1,400 days. This is 3 times longer than the Battle of Stalingrad and a full year longer than the siege of Leningrad during the World War II. It is considered to be the longest blockade of a city in a modern military history. Recast in our contemporary language, this amounts to a 4-year-long lockdown or a quarantine of an entire city from the rest of the world, with the added danger introduced by the consistent war activities. During the siege, approximately 300,000 citizens of Sarajevo were physically and psychologically cut off from the external world. Stern mountains encircling the city served as a physical barrier for the blockade that was enforced by the occupying troops, who controlled the flow of goods and prevented citizens from leaving. Throughout the siege, the physical destruction was extensive. Sarajevo city center was exposed to intense daily shelling from the surrounding mountains, upon which 120 mortars and 250 tanks were stationed. Mountains surrounding the city were also used for sniper positions, providing a safe distance and giving an excellent view of the city and its traffic. On average, Sarajevo experienced 330 shell impacts per day, although there were periods, such as summer of 1993, when more than 3,500 daily impacts were recorded. By the end of that summer, virtually all buildings were damaged and more than 30,000 were completely destroyed. Once the war broke out and the fighting started, the scope, the mode, and the meaning of activities for the besieged citizens drastically changed. The destruction of the built environment abruptly transformed the everyday activities of the entire civilian population. During the initial months of the siege, the supply of water, food, and electricity, and other daily necessities was frequently interrupted, precipitating abrupt changes in many routine daily activities. As you can see on this image, Sarajevans tried to go about their routine daily activities, but in a very different setting, which was drastically altered by military activities which took place in and around the city. Quite often, buildings and spaces that used to have a certain function during the peacetime assumed quite a different function during the time of the siege. Here you can see during ceasefire, citizens washing their clothes in the very shallow Miljacka River or getting a haircut on in the outdoors. Quite often urban spaces that were used for leisure or streets that were used for strolling or casually walking on them also assumed very different wartime functions. Urban spaces were turned into gardens and cemeteries, and trees from city parks and boulevards were cut down and used for heating and cooking. Before the war, Sarajevo had an extensive and well-developed public transportation system, but as you can see here, during the time of the siege, the system was not functioning very much, and most of the time during the war activities, citizens tried to move briskly through the city, so even the very rudimentary public transportation system which still existed was utilized with haste. These are some of my favorite images from the siege because they depict the attempt to maintain regular activities and regular life in a very, very different setting, in the setting of radical change. As you can see on the in the upper left-hand corner, there are people waiting to cross the street. The gentleman in the beige suit is obviously dressed up to go to work. And he is waiting behind this UN transporter. The reason why they're waiting here is that there's sniper fire at that crossing, and they are unable to cross. On the lower right-hand corner, you can see an image of people actually crossing behind the white transporter. The transporter is moving, and they're running in conjunction with the movement of the transporter in order to be able to cross the street. However, most importantly, the life in the city started to occur on two vertically divided levels. There was the overground city and the underground city. The overground city was very dangerous. As you saw, it was frequently a high-risk battlefield, and people's movements were often restricted to minimum. So the time spent in the overground city was very compressed. In contrast, the underground city became a place where people spent most of their time. Sleeping, eating, playing, schooling, and socializing all happened underground, where one was relatively safe from the artillery fire. Beyond the functions of survival spaces, the shelters, the basements, and the corridors of buildings enabled and encouraged important activities of redefining, reimagining, and reconstituting social life under the siege. They became what Armina Pilav calls unmoored spaces, or civilian settings for reactions to military aggression. Quite often, these unmoored spaces facilitated mixture of unmoored activities. Some are well documented. Evocative of this time is Sarajevo War Theater, which was founded at the beginning of the siege. In September of 1992, they premiered play by Safet Plakalo and Dubravko Bibanovic called The Shelter. The play was inspired by the siege and largely rehearsed underground and in the basements. The play opens as the artists debate the sense of theater and art at the times of war. In May of 1993, Inela Nogic won the Miss Besieged Sarajevo pageant, which was also held in the basement to avoid grenade and sniper attacks. Hearts melted worldwide when, instead of customarily wishing for world peace, as she was crowned the pageant queen, the 17-year-old unfolded a banner that read, "Don't let them kill us." At the height of the siege, about 65,000 children remained in the city. The reason for such a high percentage of children in the city is complex, and perhaps we can pick it up in the Q&A section if you find it interesting. While their daily experiences and the activities during the siege varied a lot depending on the geographical area of the city in which they lived, some city areas were shelled more than others. Scarce survey data largely depict a grim everyday reality for most of these children. Data tell us that approximately 40% of young people had been directly exposed to gunfire, 51% have seen someone killed, 39% had seen one or more family member killed, 19% have witnessed a massacre, 48% had their home occupied by others, and 73% had their homes attacked or shelled. Additionally, 89% lived in underground shelters during some part of the siege. Drawing upon this data, a UN report compiled in 1994 at the height of the hostilities concludes by suggesting a high probability that psychological trauma suffered during the siege will bear heavily on the lives of some. So, contemporary research with young children examining their development amidst the condition of forced migration, war, or environmental degradation overwhelmingly highlights the damage to their emotional health. Yet, systematic epidemiological studies and meta-analysis of psychological research show that, depending on the specific context and the exact nature of their experience, somewhere between 10 and 45% of young people growing up amidst the conditions of radical change experience long-term anxiety, depression, or otherwise show symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. While these are considerable numbers, 10 to 45% is not a small percentage, they leave us wondering if the complete experience of all young children growing up in challenging situations can indeed be captured by answering a question, how traumatized did they all really feel in the end? contemporary psychology often tends to do this. Surely, different experiences in challenging circumstances result in vastly different intensities of feelings and ranges of thought processes. More significantly, these findings give rise to a number of empirical and theoretical questions, chief among which is how did those 55 to 90% of others, those who did not develop or report symptoms of PTSD, respond? Are they, from a psychological point of view, the same or similar to those young people who did not experience war or forced migration? And what are the reasons for relative absence of emotional difficulties in at least about half of war affected population? Research increasingly shows that development amidst the conditions of radical change leaves its mark, which does not have to be exclusively emotional or exclusively negative. Emerging research that builds upon the work of Lev Vygotsky suggests that young people growing up in times of social, political, or economic instability often use the affordances of their volatile context as tools for psychological growth. In other words, rather than viewing the processes of growing up during war as a homogeneous experience that eventually leads to damaged emotional health, it is likely that diverse wartime experiences by different individuals produce a different range and intensity of feelings and lead to an array of different cognitive and emotional processes. Until a few months ago, from the vantage of relatively peaceful and safe Western societies, where armed conflicts and urban destructions are frequently seen as something that happens to other people in faraway places, it was difficult to imagine that everyday lives of young people growing up in Sarajevo during the Bosnian War included educational activities. Possibly even more difficult to recognize was that learning and development continued to occur during this time and that multiple contexts for developmental activities were available. With the entire country at war, the capital under siege, and daily shelling of the city, organizing educational activities was difficult. Occasionally, schools were directly hit by artillery fire. In November of 1993, for example, a shell exploded close to a school building entrance at Sarajevo's Alipashino Polje neighborhood, killing 4 students and 1 teacher. By the end of the siege, 17 city schools were completely incapacitated due to shelling, and 90 buildings were damaged. Moreover, holding classes even in school buildings that were not um, damaged by shelling was rarely possible. The particular spatial and physical affordances that characterized the built spaces of schools made them ideally suited for military uses. At the start of the war, the units of Bosnian army regularly appropriated school buildings for military purposes. In the absence of appropriate army barracks, schools were chosen as suitable spaces for accommodating a large number of troops. So, quickly, when the siege started, effectively all educational activities were forced out of their previous spaces and into informal spaces such as basements of neighborhood buildings, retail spaces, and bomb shelters. Much like other aspects of civilian life, educational activities also transformed under the conditions of the siege. At the height of the siege, the educational activities included primarily 2 modes of educational instruction. One was war schools, and here in the upper left-hand corner you can see a picture from one of the war schools, constituted at the start of the siege within safe spaces that were improvised and temporary. War schools functioned without a single permanent location. Instead, these makeshift institutions gathered teachers and students around educational activities within physical spaces that were safe from war activities. However, there were times when intense bombardment and street warfare rendered Sarajevo so dangerous that it prevented civilians and young people from even venturing outside. During the most dangerous time of the siege, even the activities of war schools halted. But the radio school became especially meaningful in the lives of young people. Originally designed by Radio Sarajevo as an auxiliary tool aiming to supplement classroom activities, in the context of extreme danger, radio school became the main educational access broadcasting curriculum daily. So these two modes of educational instructions were available to the children and young people throughout the prolonged siege of Sarajevo. So as we approach the final third of the presentation, rather than leaving you with some big words about how my research led me to understand the conditions of radical change as those circumstances in which space and time, these two very basic categories of human existence, abruptly and suddenly compress, expand, or otherwise change, I would like to show you some work that I did with now adults who, as young people, lived through the siege of Sarajevo. If you remember, what led me to start doing research in Sarajevo is that I was interested in how thought processes changed during the time of radical change, being a bit suspicious of this very uniform narrative that psychology had to offer behind the trauma theory. I wanted to employ methodology of narrative inquiry in order to see and analyze the changes in thought processes that occurred because of the siege and because these people lived through a prolonged siege. So during my time in Sarajevo, I conducted a number of research workshops where participants wrote narratives. So consider the following narrative written by Emina, who is 33 years old at the time when she's participating in the study that I conducted, and this was in 2016. Asked to write a letter to a friend who migrated abroad, and Bosnia has had a very high rate of immigration during the war and after the war as well, and describe how Sarajevo has changed since the war ended. Emina writes, "The change has been enormous. We have electricity, water, there is nothing shooting at us, but I still twitch at every loud sound or stronger blow. Now I live on the first floor of a house, and I again have my own room, rather than a corner in the basement, as I did during the war. For a long time I was really afraid, but time cures all wounds." This narrative, which captures the bare surface of thoughts and feelings and events that Emina faced over the past 25 years since the war ended, likely encountering an abundance of memories during the process of narrating, impels us to confront some difficult problems of enactment and representation of thought processes in narrative. Namely, Emina anchors her response in the magnitude of change that occurred over the past 25 years. When analyzing her narrative from the perspective of what American sociolinguist William Labov calls evaluative function, or what we have come to know in psychology via Jerome Bruner as the landscape of consciousness, we notice that she frequently employs psychological intensifiers. They are in linguistics often referred to as grammatical modifiers, such as enormous, really, afraid, long, time, still, and so forth. She does this in order to highlight the scale of difference between her contemporary life in Sarajevo and her life in the city during the siege. However, it is by invoking the comparison of spatial and physical aspects of her current residential conditions, first floor of a house, and the inhabited environment, I again have my own room, with the space that she occupied during the war, a corner in the basement, that Emina's narrative really captures the significance of her improvement in her life since the war ended. Presence of environmental elements in narrative constructions helps to alert the reader that so much of what we do, as well as what we think, feel, and understand about our world, is integrally dependent upon the physical landscape within which we situate ourselves. You may have noticed this when you traveled, especially before the coronavirus, but change the landscape that surrounds you, and often your feelings and thoughts change as well. We have electricity, water, Emina writes, enumerating and emphasizing the infrastructural elements that are now present but were once missing. But while such overt elements inscribed in the content of her writing are relatively easy to identify, Emina's response also helps to highlight several pragmatic elements related to the enactment of space and time in narrative. Namely, content-based environmental elements such as basement, water, electricity, and so forth are reinforced and transitioned from past to present upon a temporal axis that is constituted by prepositions and sometimes adverbs, words that introduce key spatio-relational and temporal information into the text, hence orienting the reader through the narrated space and time. Preposition is a word or a set of words that indicates location, such as in, near, beside, on top of, or some other relationship between a noun and a pronoun or other parts of the sentence, after, besides, instead of, in accordance with. Prepositions introduce key and necessary spatio-relational informations, hence orienting the reader through the narrated space and time. In the example that you have in front of you, prepositions of time, such as during, for a long time, and adverbs of frequency and time, such as again, still temporally animate Emina's narrative. Further, she spatially renders her narrative activities by employing prepositions of location such as at, on, and in. Together, the overt references to material elements, prepositions help to provide a setting in which a reader can grasp the significance of Emina's psychological processes, especially in relations to her environment. Once readers can understand the spatio-temporal setting, they can also begin to understand why Emina still twitches at every louder sound or a stronger blow, even in the time when there is nothing shooting at her. In absence of such markers for space and time, her narrative would be hard to understand and her psychological reactions would be difficult to make sense of. Seen from this perspective, analyzing the relationship between the narrator and space and time captured by the narrative response becomes integral to understanding Emina's experience. This is the frame of the narrative that involves only the environmental and environmental factors and prepositions so that you can see the extent to which they are employed in the narrative. So as I said, prepositions are important vehicles for indicating semantic roles in narrative. They have many ways that they're used. They can be prepositions of actions, they can be prepositions of time, or prepositions of a way that something is done. The distinction that I found the most helpful in my research is to segregate them according to the linguistic distinction between non-dimensional and dimensional prepositions. Non-dimensional prepositions are those that indicate abstract meanings concerning complex logical relations and carry meaning modalities such as causality, partitivity, and unity, while dimensional prepositions are especially interesting because they are characterized by measurability and are subcategorized into the prepositions of time and prepositions of place. Looking at the use of prepositions, especially dimensional prepositions in narratives, we find that first of all, the people who as young children grew up during the siege use more prepositions in their narratives, even now 25 years after the siege, than do people who did not grow up in the conditions of radical change. So it appears that their thought processes are hyper-attuned to the conditions of space and time and are hyper-attuned to the experience of space and time. And we also notice that they use more prepositions when they're asked to directly describe the events of the war and the siege than the events that precede or come after the war and the siege. Again, as I said, once we separate the prepositions into dimensional and non-dimensional, this distinction becomes even more pronounced, and we can see how it's even within the category of prepositions, it's especially the dimensional prepositions that get employed in order to describe the events of the siege. So if any of you are interested more in the work that I did, I published a lot of it already. Um, you can email me and I can send you some of my papers. For example, I published the general framework of this work in human development in 2016. The work with prepositions was published in Narrative Inquiry last year, I believe, Ecological Landscape in Narrative Thought. And the work on war schools and the radio school was published just last week in Pedagogy, Culture, and Society. So if anybody is interested in any of any of those aspects of my work, please let me know and I will email you the related papers. So thank you very much, and I look forward to questions and answers.